At Christmas dinner, my son asked, "Mom, how are you liking the car?" I replied, "What car?" My lying daughter-in-law's face went whiter than fresh snow. Then that actress faked a dramatic fainting spell right there at the table. She just didn't expect me to find out everything. Madison suddenly clutched her chest and collapsed backward in her chair like she was performing for an audience. The wine glass in her hand tumbled to the floor, red liquid spreading across the hardwood like spilled blood. "She's faking," I said, immediately not moving from my seat. "Mom, she wouldn't do that," Ethan said, already jumping up to help her, his chair scraping against the floor. "We need to get her to the hospital." Of course, I went along. Someone had to witness this performance, and after 30 years of raising Ethan alone, I developed a sixth sense for detecting lies. The drive to the hospital was tense. Ethan kept checking on Madison in the rearview mirror while she maintained her barely conscious act. I sat in the passenger seat watching this charade unfold and feeling my suspicion grow with every fake whimper. At the hospital, Madison lay on the gurney with her eyes fluttering dramatically. The nurses bustled around, checking her vitals, while she played her part to perfection. When she finally came to after 15 minutes of medical theater, she launched into her prepared sob story. "Honey, I'm so sorry," she whimpered to Ethan, reaching for his hand with trembling fingers. "I crashed the car that was supposed to be delivered to your mom. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to stress you out. You just got back from that business trip yesterday and you were already so tired." "Wait, what car?" That's when everything clicked into place, like puzzle pieces forming a very ugly picture. Let me explain what's really going on here, because this story is more twisted than a pretzel factory having a bad day. My son Ethan is 31 years old and worth about $9 million. He built a software company from nothing. The same kid I raised working 3 jobs when his father abandoned us 28 years ago. Ethan was only 3 when Gary walked out, owing rent and leaving bills scattered everywhere like confetti after the world's worst party. I worked at a diner from 600 a.m. to 200 p.m., cleaned offices from 300 to 900 p.m., and stocked shelves at the grocery store on weekends. Some nights I fell asleep at the kitchen table, still in my uniform, with Ethan's homework spread in front of me. But we made it work. Ethan was brilliant even as a kid, always tinkering with computers and talking about algorithms I didn't understand. But here's where it gets interesting. 4 years ago, Ethan's software sale to Redwood Systems made the local papers a feel-good story about a local boy who made it big. The article included his photo and mentioned his company's value. Suddenly, after 28 years of complete silence, guess who shows up, wanting to reconnect with his successful son? That's right, dear old Dad Gary, with perfect timing and empty pockets. Ethan was so hungry for a father that he welcomed Gary with open arms. I understood why. Every kid wants to believe their absent parent left for noble reasons, not because they were a deadbeat who couldn't handle responsibility. 8 months after Gary's miraculous return, he introduced Ethan to Madison, a sweet young woman who seemed perfect for my son. She was charming, attentive, and said all the right things about wanting a family. They dated for a year, got married in a small ceremony, and Ethan moved to another city with his new wife. He was finally living his dream of having a complete family father-wife, the whole package. Except Ethan had bought me a car last week as an early Christmas gift, since he was traveling for business. He asked Madison to deliver it when she visited while he was gone. Ethan got back yesterday, and this was the first chance he'd had to ask me about it. The problem, Madison never delivered any car, and now she's lying about crashing it. I feel terrible. Madison continued at the hospital, tears streaming down her face in perfectly timed drops. The roads were so slippery from the rain, and the other driver just ran into me at that intersection near your mom's house. The mechanic said the frame was bent and it would cost more to fix than it was worth, so I had to sell it for parts just to cover the towing. Ethan bought every word. When you're desperate for family, you'll believe anything to keep the fantasy alive. I watched my son's face as he absorbed her story. Saw the concern and guilt there. He was already blaming himself for asking her to deliver the car. "Don't worry, Mom," Ethan said, looking between his wife and me with earnest eyes. "I'll get you another car, a better one. The important thing is that Madison's okay." I bit my tongue. My brilliant son had built a tech empire from scratch. But when it came to reading people, he had the emotional intelligence of a golden retriever, trusting and completely missing the obvious tricks. As we left the hospital, I caught Madison's reflection in the automatic doors. For just a moment, when she thought no one was looking, her helpless victim mask slipped. The expression underneath was calculating and cold. The look of someone who'd just successfully pulled off a con. If acting was a crime, she'd deserve an Oscar and a prison sentence. That night, as Ethan fussed over his traumatized wife, and I played the part of the understanding mother-in-law, I made a decision. If my daughter-in-law thought she could con my son, she'd picked the wrong family to mess with. After all, I'd spent 30 years protecting Ethan from the world. I wasn't about to stop now, especially when the threat was sleeping in his bed and had access to his bank accounts. The game was on. The next morning, while Ethan was at the office making money, and Madison was probably rehearsing her next performance, I decided to fact-check her story. 30 years of single motherhood had taught me that when something doesn't add up, you'd better start doing the math yourself, and Madison's story had more holes than Swiss cheese. I poured myself a strong cup of coffee, sat at my kitchen table with my reading glasses on, and picked up the phone. Time to channel my inner detective. Riverside Auto Group. This is Josh Miller speaking. Hi, this is Linda Parker. You delivered a car to my daughter-in-law, Madison Parker, about 10 days ago. A white Honda Accord. Oh, sure. The white Accord. Beautiful car, fully loaded. Is everything okay with it? I paused, choosing my words carefully. Actually, that's what I'm calling about. She mentioned there was some kind of accident. Accident? Josh's voice went up an octave, genuine confusion clear in his tone. Ma'am, I delivered that car personally to the address she provided. She was thrilled when I arrived. Signed all the paperwork with the biggest smile I'd seen all week. Even took photos with it. Said she wanted to document the moment. My grip tightened on the phone. Photos. How nice. There was a pause. Then Josh continued. Actually, now that I think about it, she did ask some unusual questions about the resale value and how quickly someone could transfer ownership. I remember thinking it was odd, since most people don't ask about selling a car they just received, but I figured maybe she was just the planning type. Resale value. Of course she did. Little Miss Innocent had been calculating profit margins from minute one. She didn't mention any concerns about the vehicle or road conditions. I pressed not a one. Actually, she seemed pretty excited. Made some comment about how this was going to solve some financial problems. Josh chuckled. I remember thinking it was funny. Most people buy cars to create financial problems, not solve them. I bet it was going to solve her problems. All right. The kind of problems that involved unauthorized access to other people's money. After thanking Josh and hanging up, I sat back in my chair, my suspicions confirmed like a medical diagnosis I didn't want to receive. Madison had lied about the accident with the creativity of a fiction writer and the conscience of a pickpocket. I spent the rest of the morning researching car insurance claims and accident reports online, trying to see if there was any record of the supposed crash. Nothing. No police reports, no insurance claims, no record anywhere of an accident involving a white Honda Accord in the past 2 weeks. 2. When Ethan came home for lunch, I tried a careful approach, which for me meant not immediately calling his wife a lying thief. Honey, maybe we should help Madison report the accident to insurance, I suggested while he made himself a sandwich. She might be able to recover some money even if the other driver was uninsured. She already handled all that, Mom. Ethan barely looked up from spreading mustard on his bread. She said the other driver didn't have insurance and left the scene before the police arrived. No witnesses either. One of those hit-and-run situations you hear about. How convenient. A ghost accident with a phantom driver and no witnesses. What about the police report? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Mom. His voice carried that warning tone I remembered from his teenage years, the same one he used when I questioned whether he'd really done his homework. Madison was traumatized by the whole experience. She probably forgot some details or mixed them up. Can you just give her a break? Sure, I'd give her a break, right after she gave me back my car and my peace of mind. That evening, Gary joined us for dinner, as he had most nights since moving back to town 4 years ago, right after Ethan's success hit the papers. What a coincidence. He was telling some long, winding story about his business ventures over the past 28 years, painting himself as a misunderstood entrepreneur who'd been searching for the right opportunity. The details were vague, the timeline was fuzzy, and the whole narrative sounded like something he'd pulled from a collection of motivational posters. You know, Ethan, Gary said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. I've been thinking about that investment opportunity we discussed last week, the one that requires some upfront capital. Ethan's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. That's right, Dad. Did you need me to transfer that money we talked about? I nearly choked on my wine. Here we go again. Another episode of How to Part a Fool from His Money, starring my well-meaning but financially naive son. Well, if you're sure it's not too much trouble. Son, Gary said, with just the right amount of hesitation. Just until the deal closes next month. Of course not. Your family. And there it was, the magic word that made Ethan's critical thinking disappear faster than free samples at Sam's Club. Later, as I loaded the dishwasher and tried to process the evening's events, I caught a glimpse of Madison and Gary on the back patio through the kitchen window. They were standing close together, heads bent in intense conversation. Their body language was familiar, comfortable, not like two people who were still getting to know each other. When Ethan wandered out to join them with his coffee, they immediately stepped apart like teenagers caught kissing behind the school building. The conversation switched to harmless topics. The weather, the neighbor's new fence, Ethan's work schedule. But I'd seen enough. Something was definitely going on between those two, and it had nothing to do with normal in-law bonding. The way they moved around each other, the quick glances, the seamless way they changed subjects when Ethan appeared. It all screamed conspiracy. I finished cleaning the kitchen and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept turning over the details. The missing car, the phantom accident, the convenient timing of Gary's return, the suspicious investment opportunities, and now this obvious secret communication between my son's wife and father. Individual coincidences could be explained away. But this many red flags pointed to something much bigger than a simple car accident. The question was, how deep did this go, and how much was Ethan already in? I needed concrete information about Gary's past. So the next morning, I drove to our old neighborhood to see Dolores. She'd lived on Oak Lane for 40 years and had a memory sharper than her garden shears. If anyone could tell me the truth about Gary Parker, it would be her. The neighborhood looked smaller than I remembered, the houses more worn down, but Dolores's garden was still immaculate. I found her kneeling among her rose bushes, wearing the same style of cotton dress and sun hat she'd worn for decades. Linda, she called out, struggling to her feet and wiping dirt from her hands. What a surprise. What brings you back to the old neighborhood? I wanted to ask you about Gary, I said, deciding to cut straight to the chase. At our age, there wasn't time for extended pleasantries. Her weathered face immediately darkened like storm clouds gathering. That man, I wondered when someone would come asking about him. Sit down, mija. You're going to need to hear this. We settled on her front porch, the same place where she used to shell peas while keeping an eye on all the neighborhood kids. The wicker chairs creaked under our weight, and I could hear the distant sound of children playing in a nearby yard, a sound that took me back to when Ethan was small. Gary disappeared owing 3 months' rent to Mrs. Rivera next door. Dolores began settling into her storytelling rhythm. Left bills scattered all over that apartment like confetti after the world's most expensive party that nobody wanted to attend. Electric company, phone company, credit cards, everyone came looking for him. He never sent money letters, anything in all those years. Nothing. Not one word for over 2 decades. Dolores's voice carried the weight of genuine disappointment. Poor Mrs. Rivera had to clean out that apartment herself when the landlord finally gave up waiting for the rent. She found pictures of you and little Ethan just thrown in a cardboard box like yesterday's newspaper. Some were torn, some had coffee stains on them, like they meant nothing to him. My stomach dropped like an elevator with cut cables. Ethan had spent years wondering if his father ever thought about him creating elaborate fantasies about why Gary had left and whether he'd ever come back. Here was the brutal truth. Gary had literally thrown their pictures away like garbage. Mrs. Rivera brought the photos to me, Dolores continued. Thought maybe you'd want them someday. I still have them in my house if you want to see them. I shook my head, not trusting my voice. Ethan didn't need to see physical evidence of how little he'd meant to his father. He was always a smooth talker, Dolores said, her tone shifting to disgust. Had big dreams, bigger mouth, could convince you that black was white and up was down if you listened long enough. But when it came time to pay up or show up, he'd vanish like smoke. And now, he's back. Right after Ethan's picture was in the paper 4 years ago. Funny timing, no? Dolores's eyes flashed with anger. 28 years of silence. Then suddenly, he wants to be Father of the Year the minute his son gets rich. Did anyone else around here hear from him over the years? Any mutual friends or relatives? Nobody. And trust me, in this neighborhood, news travels faster than gossip at a church social. If Gary had contacted anyone, I would have heard about it. Dolores leaned forward, lowering her voice. There were rumors, though. Mrs. Rivera's nephew works for a collection agency, and he said Gary's name popped up on their list several times over the years. Different cities, always owing money, always disappearing when things got tough. The picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't pretty. Gary wasn't a man who'd made mistakes and learned from them. He was a professional disappointment, someone who made a career out of using people and moving on when the well ran dry. I thanked Dolores and promised to visit again soon, but my mind was already racing as I drove home. I had solid information now, but I knew Ethan wasn't ready to hear it. He'd spent his whole life crafting a story about why his father left. Maybe Gary was young and scared. Maybe he felt unworthy. Maybe he was protecting them somehow. The truth was much simpler and much uglier. Gary was a user who'd abandoned his family because responsibility was inconvenient. When I got home, Ethan was in the living room with his laptop, probably working on his next million while his parasites planned how to spend it. Mom, where have you been? I tried calling your cell. Just visiting old friends and taking a trip down memory lane. I settled into my favorite chair, studying his face. Ethan, we need to talk about your father. His expression immediately hardened like concrete setting in the sun. Mom, please. I know you have concerns, but he's trying. Can't you see that he's been nothing but supportive since he came back? He abandoned you for 28 years, Ethan. 28 years without so much as a birthday card or a phone call. People change, Mom. Ethan's voice took on that defensive tone he used when he felt cornered. Maybe he was scared. Maybe he felt like he'd already messed up too badly to reach out. Maybe he thought we were better off without him, but he came back 4 years ago, and he's been trying to make up for lost time ever since. I wanted to tell him about Dolores, about the thrown-away pictures, and unpaid bills, about the collection agencies and the pattern of using people, but I could see Ethan wasn't ready to hear it. He'd invested too much emotionally in this reunion to accept that it might be built on lies. "Just be careful with your money, okay?" I said instead. "Don't make any big financial decisions without thinking them through twice." "Mom, I'm 31 years old. I built a multi-million-dollar company from the ground up. I think I can handle my own finances." "I know you can. I'm not questioning your business sense. I'm questioning their motives." "Their motives?" Ethan's voice rose slightly. "Mom, I need this. I need to believe that families can be fixed, that people can change, that it's not too late to have the father I always wanted." And there it was, the heart of the matter. Ethan wasn't just welcoming Gary back. He was trying to heal a wound that had been bleeding for 28 years. The problem was that Gary might be pouring salt into that wound instead of helping it heal. That was the real tragedy. Ethan was so focused on the family he thought he could have that he couldn't see what was happening to the family he actually had. And I was starting to suspect that this blindness wasn't accidental. It was being carefully cultivated by two people who knew exactly which buttons to push. The next afternoon, I decided it was time for some field research. I told Ethan I was going shopping at the mall. Technically true, since I did plan to buy a coffee and maybe a magazine. What I didn't mention was that I'd be conducting my own little surveillance operation. I positioned myself at a table in the food court with a clear view of the main entrance like a spider, waiting patiently in her web. I'd brought a book and reading glasses to look like any other grandmother killing time, but my attention was focused on watching for familiar faces. After sitting there for over an hour, nursing an overpriced latte, and watching teenagers make questionable fashion choices, I spotted them. Madison walked in first, looking around nervously like she was meeting a drug dealer instead of her father-in-law. She was dressed casually, but still looked out of place, checking her phone every few seconds. Gary appeared about 10 minutes later, scanning the crowd with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to watch for trouble. When he spotted Madison, they didn't wave or show any obvious signs of recognition. Instead, they moved toward each other with the choreographed casualness of people who'd done this before. They chose a table near the Books-A-Million entrance, partially hidden behind a decorative pillar, but with clear sightlines to the exits. Professional paranoia or guilty consciences? I was betting on the latter. I moved closer, abandoning my book, and pretending to browse the jewelry kiosk about 20 feet away. My hearing wasn't what it used to be, but I caught fragments of their conversation carried on the mall's echo. "Told you we needed to be more careful. She's asking too many questions. Ethan's starting to notice the patterns." My heart rate spiked. They were talking about me, and they were talking about Ethan noticing something. Noticing what? The financial irregularities, the timing, coincidences, the way they seemed to communicate without words. I fumbled with my phone, trying to get a decent photo without being obvious about it. My camera skills were roughly equivalent to my ability to perform brain surgery. But I managed to capture one blurry image that clearly showed both their faces and their intense conversation. When I got home, Ethan was in his office on a video call with clients in Washington State. I waited until he finished, then knocked on his door with what I hoped was casual maternal concern. "Hey, honey, look what I saw at the mall today." I showed him the photo on my phone screen. Ethan squinted at the blurry image, then looked at me with mild exasperation. "Mom, they're family now." "Of course, they talk to each other, and this photo is so blurry I can barely tell who it is. But look at their body language. They're leaning in like they're sharing secrets." "Maybe they were planning a surprise for you. Or maybe Dad needed advice about something and didn't want to bother me while I was working." Ethan's ability to find innocent explanations for suspicious behavior was truly a gift. The kind of gift that made people easy targets for con artists. Ethan, doesn't it seem strange that your father came back right when you became successful after 28 years of nothing? He looked up from his computer with the tired patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. Mom, I love you, but this paranoia has to stop. Dad and Madison are both important to me, and I need you to try to accept that. I realized my evidence was weak. A blurry photo of two people talking wasn't exactly smoking gun material. It was more like a slightly warm BB gun that might have been fired recently. That night, I lay awake thinking about Ethan's finances. I knew he trusted Madison completely with their household money. As his wife, she had access to their joint accounts and often handled paperwork while he focused on running his business. Ethan had always been generous about delegating tasks he found boring, and apparently financial management fell into that category. But what if that trust was being systematically abused? What if those boring financial tasks included unauthorized transfers and questionable investments? Ethan might not notice small amounts going missing, especially if they were disguised as legitimate business expenses or family needs. I made a mental note to find a way to examine Ethan's financial records more closely. Not because I wanted to invade his privacy, but because I was starting to suspect that his privacy had already been invaded by people with much worse intentions than mine. The problem was figuring out how to do it without Ethan feeling like I was crossing a line. He was already defensive about Gary and Madison. If he thought I was spying on his finances, he might cut me out of his life entirely. But if I was right about what was happening, Ethan might not have a financial life left to cut me out of. The next morning, I called my old friend Susan, whose son was an accountant. If I was going to investigate financial fraud, I needed to understand what signs to look for. Susan, hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to steal money from a family member without them noticing right away, how would they do it? Linda, what's going on? Just humor me. Hypothetically, Susan sighed. Well, small amounts over time would be the smart way, maybe disguised as legitimate expenses or investments. Set up automatic transfers that the victim approves once and then forgets about. Use joint accounts where both people have access, but only one person pays attention to the details. My blood ran cold. That sounded exactly like Ethan's situation with Madison. The key, Susan continued, would be finding someone who trusts completely and doesn't like dealing with financial paperwork. Someone successful enough that small amounts wouldn't be missed immediately. And how would someone catch this kind of theft? Look for patterns in the bank statements transfers that happen regularly but don't correspond to known expenses. Check for new accounts or investments that the victim doesn't remember authorizing. Compare signatures on financial documents. I thanked Susan and hung up my mind, already forming a plan. I needed to get a look at Ethan's financial records, but I had to be smart about it. If Madison and Gary were running a long con on my son, I needed evidence that would convince Ethan before it was too late. The question was, how much time did I have before they decided they'd taken enough and disappeared, leaving Ethan broke and heartbroken? I decided to take a different approach and went back to the coffee shop several times over the next week, hoping to learn more about Madison and Gary's relationship. Each time, I brought a different book and tried to look like any other customer having a literary moment, instead of conducting amateur surveillance worthy of a discount spy novel. On my third attempt, after consuming enough caffeine to power a small aircraft, I finally spotted them again. This time, I was more strategic about positioning myself close enough to observe, but hidden behind a display of travel mugs and seasonal merchandise. The teenage barista, a girl with purple hair and multiple ear piercings, was wiping down tables nearby with the enthusiasm of someone who'd rather be literally anywhere else. I decided to take a calculated risk. "Excuse me," I said, when she approached my table with her cleaning cloth. "That couple over there, they come here a lot, don't they?" She glanced over and nodded without much interest. "Oh, yeah, those two. They're here pretty regularly. Maybe once or twice a week. Always order the same thing. Black coffee for him, caramel macchiato for her. They tip okay, but they always seem kind of stressed about something." They seem familiar somehow. How long have they been coming here? The girl thought for a moment, her face scrunching up in concentration. I've been working here for about 16 months, and they were already regulars when I started, so at least that long, maybe longer. They definitely have that been doing this forever vibe. You know that timeline would put their relationship back to before Madison even met Ethan, or at least very early in their courtship. Interesting, like finding out your favorite restaurant had been serving cat food the whole time. Technically possible, but highly suspicious. They always seem so serious when they talk, I commented, trying to keep my voice casual. Yeah, they do. And they never really seem happy to see each other, if you know what I mean. Like, not like family or friends, would be more like... She paused, searching for the right comparison. Like business partners who don't particularly like each other, but need each other for something. Business partners. That phrase hit me like a cold slap across the face. They always sit in that same corner. The girl continued, warming to the subject, now that she had an audience. And they're always looking around like they're worried someone might overhear them. Kind of paranoid, actually. I thanked her and sat back in my chair, processing this information like a computer analyzing data. Madison and Gary had been meeting regularly for at least 16 months, possibly longer. They acted like business partners rather than family members. They chose secluded seating and watched for eavesdroppers. This wasn't the beginning of a beautiful friendship between in-laws. This was evidence of a long-term partnership that predated Madison's relationship with Ethan. When I got home, I found Ethan in his home office signing a stack of papers with the mechanical precision of someone performing a familiar routine. The sight made my stomach clench. "What are those?" I asked, trying to sound casual rather than alarmed. "Just some financial stuff. Madison prepared for me," Ethan said without looking up. "Investment paperwork, expense reports, tax documents. You know how I hate dealing with all the administrative details. Gives me a headache just thinking about it." I watched him sign document after document without reading them, trusting his wife's explanations completely. "Ethan, do you actually review these before you sign them? Madison explains them to me," he said, finally glancing up with mild irritation. "She's got a good head for numbers, and she knows I trust her judgment completely. Why would I need to read every line when I have someone I trust handling the details? But shouldn't you at least skim them just to know what you're agreeing to?" Ethan's expression shifted to the patient tolerance of someone explaining obvious concepts to a slow child. "Mom, I trust my wife. She handles our personal finances so I can focus on growing the business. It's called division of labor. She's good with money management. I'm good with technology and client relations." The innocent logic was heartbreaking. Ethan had built his entire financial life on the assumption that the people closest to him had his best interests at heart. It was a beautiful philosophy and a terrible vulnerability. "Besides," Ethan added, returning to his signing, "Madison shows me the important stuff. These are just routine transfers and investment adjustments." Routine transfers. My blood pressure spiked like a rocket launching. That evening at dinner, Gary mentioned his investment opportunity again, as he had every few days for the past month. The details were always vague but promising. The timeline was always urgent, and the amount needed always seemed to increase slightly each time it came up. "Ethan, that real estate deal I mentioned is moving faster than expected," Gary said, cutting his pot roast with surgical precision. "The seller wants to close by the end of next week, which means I need to move on it sooner than we discussed." "No problem, Dad." Ethan's response was immediate and generous, like someone offering to share an appetizer rather than potentially signing away tens of thousands of dollars. "Just let me know how much and when you need it transferred." I watched this exchange with growing alarm that was setting off every internal warning system I possessed. Ethan was essentially giving Gary unlimited access to his bank account, and Gary was responding with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything. "I really appreciate this, son," Gary said, his voice carrying just the right amount of gratitude and paternal pride. "It means everything to me that you trust me with something this important." Trust the magic word that made Ethan's critical thinking disappear faster than free samples at a grocery store. As I loaded the dishwasher later and tried to process the evening's revelations, I realized I was running out of time. Gary and Madison weren't just taking advantage of Ethan's generosity. They were systematically dismantling his financial security while he signed the paperwork that made it all legal. The question was no longer whether they were stealing from Ethan. The question was how much they'd already taken and how much time I had left to stop them before they disappeared with his life savings, leaving him broke and wondering how his perfect family had turned into his perfect nightmare. I needed concrete evidence, and I needed it fast, because Ethan's trust fund was about to become Ethan's tragedy, and I was the only one who could see the train wreck coming. The next morning, I decided it was time to confront Ethan with everything I'd gathered so far. I spread the evidence across his kitchen table like a prosecutor preparing for trial, the photo from the coffee shop, my notes from the conversation with Josh at the dealership, the timeline discrepancies, and my growing list of financial red flags. Ethan walked into the kitchen in his bathrobe expecting his usual quiet breakfast, and found me sitting there with what looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream laid out in front of me. "Mom, what's all this?" he asked, pouring himself coffee and eyeing my makeshift evidence board with the weariness of someone who'd walked into an intervention. "We need to talk," I said, gesturing for him to sit down. "Really talk about your father and Madison and what I think is happening to your money." "Mom, this is getting ridiculous," Ethan said, but he sat down anyway, probably hoping to humor me into dropping the subject. "You're talking about Dad and Madison like they're running some kind of elaborate scam instead of just trying to be my family. Look at the pattern, Ethan." I pointed to my timeline notes. "Your father disappeared for 28 years and came back within months of your business success making the newspapers. Madison handles all your finances and you sign whatever she puts in front of you without reading it. They meet regularly in secret and have known each other longer than you realize." "So what?" Ethan's voice was getting that defensive edge I remembered from his teenage years. "Maybe Dad introduced us when he first came back. Maybe that's how Madison and I met in the first place. And yes, I trust my wife with our money. That's what married people do when they're not busy being paranoid detectives." Ethan stood up abruptly, pacing to the window overlooking his backyard. His shoulders were tense, and I could see the conflict playing out in his posture. Love wearing with logic hope battling against growing doubt. "Mom, do you have any idea what it was like growing up without a father?" His voice cracked slightly, revealing the little boy who still lived inside my successful grown son. "Do you know how many nights I lay awake wondering if he'd ever come back? If he even remembered I existed? My heart broke for him all over again." "Ethan, I know." "No, you don't know," he continued, turning to face me with eyes bright with unshed tears. "You had to be both parents, and you did an amazing job. But I still felt that hole where a father should have been. Every school play, every birthday, every graduation, I looked for him in the crowd, even though I knew he wouldn't be there. And now, he's here." Ethan's voice grew stronger, more determined. "He wants to be part of my life. He's trying to make up for lost time, trying to be the father I always needed. And you're asking me to throw that away because of some vague suspicions and blurry photographs." "They're not vague, Ethan. They're specific, and they're adding up to something very concerning. To you, maybe, but to me, they look like coincidences and misunderstandings." Ethan sat back down, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "Mom, I need this to work. I need to believe that families can be fixed, that people can change, that it's not too late to have the relationships I always wanted." That afternoon, as if summoned by some cosmic sense of timing, Madison came to see me while Ethan was at work. She knocked on my door with her usual sweet smile, but today it seemed strained around the edges. "Linda, can we talk? I'm worried about Ethan." I invited her in, curious to see what angle she'd take this time. She settled on my couch with the careful positioning of someone who'd rehearsed this scene. "He's been so stressed lately," she said, folding her hands in her lap like a well-behaved schoolgirl. "I think all this tension between us is really affecting him. He's not sleeping well, and he's been distracted at work." The audacity was breathtaking. This woman was potentially robbing my son blind, and she was sitting in my living room expressing concern for his well-being. "I understand that it's difficult to share Ethan with new people," she continued, her voice dripping with practiced empathy. "You've had him to yourself for so long, been his whole world. It must be hard to adjust to him having a wife and reconnecting with his father." "I just want what's best for Ethan," I said, carefully studying her face for any tells. "So do I. That's why I think maybe you should consider taking a step back." Her words were gentle, but there was steel underneath. "Ethan mentioned that you've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe some time away would be good for everyone. Sometimes, distance gives us perspective we can't get when we're too close to a situation." Translation: Make yourself scarce while we finish whatever financial magic trick we're performing with your son's bank account. "Are you suggesting I'm imagining things?" I asked, keeping my voice level and watching her reaction. "Of course not." The response was too quick, too bright. But sometimes when we're worried about losing someone we love, we can see threats that aren't really there. It's natural, but it's not always accurate. She was smoother than I'd expected, laying groundwork to discredit my concerns without directly attacking my mental state. This was professional-level manipulation disguised as family concern. "I'll think about what you've said." I lied with the sincerity of a politician making campaign promises. After she left, I sat in my living room, feeling like I was in a chess game, where my opponent could see moves I didn't even know existed. Madison was trying to isolate Ethan by making him think I was becoming unstable and paranoid. Meanwhile, Gary was positioning himself as the stable, supportive father Ethan had always craved. They weren't just stealing Ethan's money. They were stealing his family connections, his support system, his ability to trust his own instincts. By the time they were finished, Ethan would be emotionally and financially devastated, wondering how the people he'd loved most had turned out to be the ones who hurt him worst. I was running out of time faster than Ethan was running out of money, and I still didn't have the smoking gun I needed to convince him. But I was starting to formulate a plan that might give me exactly the evidence I needed if I was brave enough to execute it and smart enough not to get caught. The game was escalating, and it was time for me to make a bold move. Madison had made one critical mistake in our little chat. She'd revealed that she wanted me out of the picture, at least temporarily. Like a magician accidentally showing the audience how the trick worked, she'd given me valuable information about their strategy. Time to use that information to my advantage. I called Ethan that evening and put on my best defeated mother voice, the one I'd used when he was 16, and thought he knew everything about everything. "Honey, I've been thinking about what Madison said today. Maybe she's right. Maybe I do need to get away for a while and gain some perspective on this whole situation." "Mom, you don't have to," Ethan started, but I could hear the relief in his voice underneath the protest. "No, I think it would be good for all of us. I'm going to visit your Aunt Diane in Tucson." "Give everyone some space to breathe and maybe clear my head a bit." Ethan was quiet for a moment, probably processing the unexpected turn of events. "Are you sure I don't want you to feel like we're pushing you away?" "Of course not, sweetheart. I just think some distance might help me see things more clearly. Sometimes when you're too close to a situation, you can't see the forest for the trees." "When would you leave?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll pack tonight and get an early start. The drive will give me time to think." After hanging up, I spent the evening carefully planning what would either be the smartest or stupidest thing I'd ever done. I packed a suitcase with enough clothes for a week-long trip, made a show of calling Aunt Diane to confirm my visit where Ethan could overhear, and even printed out MapQuest directions to Tucson. The next morning, I loaded my suitcase into the car, while Gary and Madison watched from Ethan's front window. I could see them standing there like vultures eyeing fresh roadkill, probably congratulating themselves on successfully manipulating the troublesome mother-in-law into removing herself from the equation. I even waved goodbye with the enthusiasm of someone heading off to a relaxing vacation instead of staging the world's most obvious fake departure. Then I drove around the block parked behind the old oak tree that blocked the view from Ethan's house and settled in to wait. If patience was a virtue, I was about to become a saint. If stupidity was a crime, I was about to become a felon. At exactly 9:30 a.m., Ethan's usual departure time for his Tuesday morning client meetings, I watched his car disappear down the street. I gave him an extra 10 minutes to clear the neighborhood, then used my spare key to sneak back into the house like a reverse burglar breaking into her own son's home. The living room was empty, but I could hear Gary and Madison talking in the kitchen, their voices more relaxed than I'd ever heard them. They were probably celebrating their victory over the suspicious mother-in-law who'd finally been neutralized. I needed concrete evidence, something Ethan couldn't dismiss or rationalize away with his impressive collection of optimistic explanations. I carefully made my way to Ethan's home office, where he kept his important papers and sometimes worked on his laptop when he wanted to avoid distractions. Ethan's filing system was organized but not obsessive. He had folders for different types of documents but wasn't paranoid about security within his own home. Why would he be? He trusted the people who had access to his house and his life. I started with the investment folder, pulling out the documents Gary had given Ethan to review over the past few months. Under the fluorescent desk light with time to examine them carefully, several things immediately stood out. The letterheads looked professionally designed, but generic, the kind of thing someone could create with basic computer software rather than actual corporate branding. The contact information led to P.O. boxes and answering services rather than real business addresses. Most damning, several of the investment opportunities were for companies I couldn't find any trace of online. Despite Ethan's fast internet connection and my admittedly amateur detective skills, I took photos of the most suspicious documents with my phone, building a case one questionable contract at a time. Then I heard voices getting louder in the living room, and my heart rate spiked like I just chugged espresso. Moving as quietly as possible, I crept closer to the doorway and positioned myself where I could listen without being seen. "Told you we needed to be more careful after that coffee shop incident," Madison was saying, her voice carrying a stress I'd never heard before. "She's been watching us. Gary taking photos, asking questions at the dealership." "She's gone now," Gary replied, with the confidence of someone who thought he'd won a chess match. "And Ethan's completely under our control. He signs whatever you put in front of him without reading it, trusts every word we say. The kid's desperate for family. It makes him easier to manipulate than a puppet show." My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone's recording function. This was it, the smoking gun I'd been searching for. "But what if she comes back with more questions?" Madison pressed. "What if she actually finds something concrete?" "She won't. And even if she does, Ethan won't believe her. The kid's too invested in this happy family fantasy to see what's right in front of him. He'd rather be broke and loved than rich and alone." "How much more do you think we can take before he notices the patterns?" "Another $60,000. Maybe $85,000 if we're smart about the timing." The beauty of this setup is that Ethan doesn't want to look too closely at the details. He's paying us to rob him. I managed to record about 10 minutes of their conversation before they moved to another room, discussing the timeline for their next phase and how to handle Ethan's increasing questions about money without arousing more suspicion. The recording wasn't just evidence of theft. It was proof of a calculated long-term conspiracy to systematically destroy my son's financial life while playing on his deepest emotional needs. As I snuck back to my car, my phone clutched in my hand like a weapon that could save Ethan's future. I realized that the hardest part wasn't over. I had the evidence I needed, but now I had to figure out how to present it in a way that would finally open Ethan's eyes without destroying him in the process. Because while Gary and Madison saw Ethan as an easy mark, I saw him as my son. And I was about to prove that protecting your family was a job that never ended, no matter how old your children got or how successful they became. I drove straight to Ethan's office with my phone clutched in my hand, like evidence that could change everything. Because that's exactly what it was. The recording was damning enough to convince any reasonable person. But I knew Ethan wasn't operating on pure reason when it came to his father and wife. The office building's lobby was busy with the usual Tuesday morning traffic people in business attire, hurrying to meetings, delivery drivers with packages, the low hum of professional ambition in motion. I felt completely out of place, like an amateur detective who'd stumbled into a real crime scene. "Mom!" Ethan looked up in surprise as I walked into his office without knocking. "I thought you were driving to Tucson today." I said, closing his office door behind me and turning the lock with deliberate emphasis. "But something came up that couldn't wait. Something that's going to change everything." Ethan's face immediately tensed like he was bracing for impact. "Mom, if this is more conspiracy theories about Dad and Madison, just listen." I pulled out my phone and set it on his desk between us, like a bomb waiting to explode. "Really listen." Without interrupting or immediately thinking of 17 different innocent explanations, Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed defensively. "Fine, but this better be good." I pressed play on the recording. Gary's voice filled the room clear and unmistakable. "She's gone now, and Ethan's completely under our control. He signs whatever you put in front of him without reading it." Ethan went very still, like a computer that had just encountered a fatal error. Madison's voice came next. "What if she comes back with more questions?" "Gary, Ethan won't believe her. The kid's too invested in this happy family fantasy to see what's right in front of him. He'd rather be broke and loved than rich and alone." Ethan's face went pale as he listened to the people he trusted most discussing him like he was a mark in a con game rather than a son and husband they supposedly loved. "How much more do you think we can take before he notices?" Madison's recorded voice asked. "Another $60,000? Maybe $85,000 if we're smart about the timing." The beauty of this setup is that Ethan doesn't want to look too closely at the details. He's paying us to rob him. By the time the recording ended, Ethan was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He stared at my phone like it contained footage of his own betrayal in high definition. That's really them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes, I recorded this 2 hours ago at your house after they thought I'd left for Tucson." Ethan was quiet for a long time, staring out his office window at a world that had just shifted completely off its axis. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless, like a computer reading data. "They really think I'm that easy to manipulate." "I'm afraid so." I reached across the desk and touched his hand gently. "And Ethan, I've been looking at those investment documents Gary gave you. I think you need to have them examined by someone who knows about financial fraud. Someone with more expertise than my suspicious mother instincts." "The investments, you think they're all fake?" "I think you need to verify everything before you sign anything else. Some of those companies don't seem to exist anywhere but on paper." Ethan ran his hands through his hair, looking lost and betrayed, and about 10 years older than he had that morning. "How long have they been planning this? How much have I already lost?" "I don't know for sure, but based on what I've learned, probably longer than we want to think about." "What do I do now?" The question came out like a plea from someone who just discovered that his entire reality was built on lies. First, we secure your finances, immediately change all your passwords, freeze any accounts they have access to, and don't sign anything else without having it reviewed by your lawyer. Then we figure out exactly what they've already taken and whether we can get any of it back. Ethan nodded slowly, but I could see the devastation in his eyes. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust, love, family, and every hope he'd nurtured for the past 4 years. I really believed Dad wanted to know me, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Maybe part of him does, Ethan. People are complicated, but that doesn't excuse what they're doing to you and Madison. I trusted her with everything. Our future, our money, our entire life together. I know you did, and that's not your fault. That's what people do when they love someone. You're supposed to be able to trust your family. Ethan was quiet for another moment, processing the magnitude of what we discovered. What if we're wrong about everything? What if there's some explanation for all this? Then we'll find out when we investigate properly with qualified professionals. But Ethan, you heard that recording. Even if they're not stealing from you, which I think they are, they're definitely manipulating you and laughing about it behind your back. He nodded reluctantly, like someone accepting a medical diagnosis they didn't want to receive. Yeah, I heard it. We can get through this, I told him, squeezing his hand. We've gotten through worse things together, and we'll get through this too. But we have to be smart about how we handle it. Ethan looked at me with something that might have been respect mixed with gratitude. I should have listened to you sooner. You weren't ready to hear it then, and that's okay. Sometimes we have to learn things in our own time, even when the tuition is expensive. How expensive do you think this lesson is going to be? We'll find out. But Ethan, whatever the cost, you're going to survive this, and you're going to be smarter and stronger because of it. He managed a weak smile. Promise? Promise. Now let's go save what's left of your fortune before they decide to take the rest of it and disappear into the sunset. As we prepared to leave his office and begin the process of untangling the financial web that Gary and Madison had woven around Ethan's life, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. Sadness for the family dreams that were about to be shattered, but determination to protect my son from any further damage. The real fight was just beginning. We spent the rest of the afternoon and evening securing Ethan's finances like we were building a fortress against an invading army. Ethan called his bank, his investment advisor, and his lawyer, explaining the situation with the grim efficiency of someone who'd just discovered his house was on fire. The picture that emerged was worse than I'd feared, but not quite as catastrophic as it could have been. Ethan had been systematically robbed, but his business acumen had saved him from total financial ruin. He'd kept his company accounts separate from his personal finances, which meant Gary and Madison had only been able to access a portion of his wealth. Look at this, Ethan said, spreading bank statements across his dining room table like evidence in a murder trial. I remember Madison telling me these transfers were for tax planning purposes, putting money aside for quarterly payments. But looking at them now, the transfers totaled nearly $82,000 over the past year, going to accounts that I can't clearly identify. The amounts were strategically small enough to avoid triggering automatic bank alerts, but they added up to more than most people made in 2 years. And these investment documents from Dad? Ethan continued examining Gary's paperwork with the scrutiny he should have applied months ago. Half of these companies don't exist. The other half are legitimate businesses, but the account numbers and contact information have been altered. It was a sophisticated scam that took advantage of Ethan's trust and his dislike of financial paperwork. They'd created a paper trail that looked legitimate on the surface but fell apart under careful examination. We also discovered that several of Ethan's credit cards had charges he didn't remember authorizing. Dinners at expensive restaurants, hotel stays, shopping sprees, all signed with his name, but in handwriting, that looked slightly different from his usual signature.
I feel like the biggest fool in the world,
Ethan said, slumping back in his chair.
You're not a fool. You're someone who loved people who didn't deserve it. There's a difference.
But I should have been more careful. I should have paid attention instead of just trusting blindly. Ethan, hindsight is always perfect. The important thing is that we caught this before they could take everything. That evening, Ethan made the difficult decision to confront Gary and Madison directly. Despite my concerns about their potential reactions, Ethan felt he needed to give them one last chance to explain themselves before involving law enforcement.
I need to hear them try to justify this,
he told me. I need to understand how they could look me in the eye every day while systematically robbing me blind. We agreed that I would stay hidden in the kitchen while Ethan confronted them in the living room, and that Ethan would record the conversation on his phone. If things got heated or dangerous, I would call the police immediately. When Ethan arrived home, Gary and Madison were watching television like any normal couple enjoying a quiet evening. They looked up with welcoming smiles when Ethan walked in, completely unaware that their world was about to implode. "How was your day, honey?" Madison asked, patting the couch cushion beside her. "You look tired."
I had an interesting day,
Ethan said, remaining standing.
Mom decided not to go to Tucson after all.
I saw Gary and Madison exchange the quickest of glances, a micro-expression of alarm that they tried to hide behind polite surprise.
"Oh,"
Madison said, her voice slightly higher than usual.
That's unexpected. Is everything okay?" "Actually, no. Everything is not okay."
Ethan pulled out his phone and set it on the coffee table. "I think we need to have a conversation about money and investments and trust, and how sometimes the people you love most are the ones who hurt you worst."
"Ethan, what's wrong?"
Gary asked. But there was a note of caution in his voice now, like someone who just realized they might be walking into a trap.
"I've been reviewing our financial records, and I have some questions that need answers."
What followed was 20 minutes of the most uncomfortable television I'd ever witnessed. Ethan methodically presented the evidence while Gary and Madison went through the classic stages of getting caught: denial, deflection, minimization, and finally, desperate justification.
"We were going to pay it back,"
Madison insisted when the lies became impossible to maintain.
"It was just temporary, just until we got back on our feet." "You have more money than you know what to do with,"
Gary added, his mask finally slipping to reveal the calculating opportunist underneath.
"We just needed to borrow a little to handle some financial emergencies." "Borrowed!"
Ethan's voice was rising now, 4 years of suppressed doubt finally finding expression.
"You stole from me. You lied to me. You manipulated me while I signed the paperwork that made your theft legal." "We are family," Gary said, playing his last desperate card. "Family helps each other through difficult times. Family doesn't steal from each other and then lie about it for months."
The conversation devolved into accusations and recriminations that made daytime talk shows look civilized. Gary became increasingly aggressive, arguing that Ethan owed him for the years he'd missed, like charging compound interest on parental abandonment. Madison alternated between tears and anger, claiming that Ethan had never really loved her anyway, and that she'd just been trying to secure their future. It was uglier than a custody battle and twice as painful to watch, but it was also revealing. Any remaining doubt about their guilt disappeared as they essentially confessed while trying to justify their actions. Ethan finally asked them to leave, and this time there was no question that it was permanent.
"You'll regret this,"
Gary said as he headed for the door, delivering threats like a villain in a bad movie.
"You're choosing that bitter old woman over your own family." "No,"
Ethan replied with quiet dignity. "I'm choosing the family that never lied to me over the family that did." After they left, Ethan and I sat in his living room processing what had just happened. The house felt different somehow, emptier, but cleaner, like a fever had finally broken. I keep thinking I should feel angrier, Ethan said, staring at his hands. But mostly, I just feel empty. That's normal. Betrayal is complicated. Betrayal, it's not just about the money. It's about trust and love and all the things you thought were real. How do I ever trust anyone again? How do I know if someone loves me or for my bank account? You don't know for certain, but you can't let their betrayal turn you into someone who's afraid to love or trust ever again. That would be letting them win twice. As we sat together in the quiet house, I realized that while we'd lost Gary and Madison, we'd gained something more valuable, the truth. And sometimes the truth is the most expensive gift you can give someone, but also the most necessary. The next few days passed in a blur of legal consultations, financial audits, and police reports. Ethan's lawyer recommended involving law enforcement immediately since the evidence of systematic theft was overwhelming, and the amounts involved crossed the threshold into felony territory. We need to move quickly, the lawyer explained during our meeting at his Riverside Business Center office. Financial fraud cases are easier to prosecute when the trail is fresh and the perpetrators haven't had time to hide assets or flee the jurisdiction. Ethan was still reluctant to see his father and wife arrested despite everything they'd done. The little boy inside him who'd waited 28 years for his daddy to come home was having trouble accepting that daddy had only returned to rob him blind. They're still my family, Ethan said during one particularly difficult conversation. Doesn't that count for something, Ethan? I said gently. They stopped being your family the moment they decided to steal from you. Real family doesn't do what they did. The investigation revealed the full scope of Gary and Madison's operation. They hadn't just been stealing from Ethan. They'd been running multiple small cons throughout the city, taking advantage of lonely people looking for love or family connections. Ethan was their biggest score, but he wasn't their only victim. Police found evidence that Gary had been using fake identities and forged documents for years, moving from city to city when his schemes fell apart. Madison had a shorter criminal history, but showed a talent for emotional manipulation that made her the perfect partner for Gary's financial scams. They were a team, Detective Carter explained. Gary would identify wealthy, lonely targets, and Madison would get close to them emotionally while Gary handled the financial side. They'd been working together for at least 4 years before they targeted your son. The timeline made me sick. Madison hadn't fallen in love with Ethan and then gotten corrupted by Gary. She'd been part of the plan from the beginning, playing a role designed to make Ethan vulnerable to his father's manipulation. Within a week, both Gary and Madison were arrested. The local news picked up the story painting Ethan as a successful businessman who'd been victimized by his own family. The attention was unwelcome but necessary. It encouraged other victims to come forward and helped build a stronger case against the perpetrators. Ethan struggled with the media coverage, feeling like his private tragedy had become public entertainment. Everyone's going to think I'm an idiot, he said after a particularly sensationalized news report. Let them think what they want, I replied. The people who matter know the truth. You were a loving son and husband who got taken advantage of by professional criminals. The legal process moved faster than I'd expected. Both Gary and Madison were offered plea deals rather than face trial, probably because their lawyers knew the evidence against them was overwhelming. Gary received 24 months in prison. Madison got 14 months, and they were ordered to pay restitution. Ethan was able to recover about $52,000 of the stolen money through asset forfeiture and frozen bank accounts. The rest was gone, spent on living expenses, legal fees, and the cost of maintaining their elaborate deception. It's not about the money, Ethan said when the final settlement was announced. $52,000, $20,000, $5,000. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I was stupid enough to let them do this to me. You weren't stupid. You were hopeful. And hope isn't a character flaw. even when it gets you hurt. Is it, though, maybe being more suspicious, more cynical would have saved me from all this? And it also would have saved you from ever experiencing real love or trust or family connection. Ethan, you can't let their betrayal turn you into someone who's afraid to open his heart. The hardest part wasn't the money or the legal proceedings. It was watching Ethan struggle with his sense of identity. He'd built his adult life around the belief that he was smart, successful, and capable of good judgment. Discovering that he'd been manipulated so completely shook his confidence in ways that would take time to rebuild. "How do I know if my business decisions are sound?" he asked one evening. "How do I know if I'm making good choices or just getting lucky? Maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was." "Ethan, you built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing. You created something valuable that improved people's lives and made you wealthy in the process. That doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen to stupid people. But I couldn't see through my own wife and father. Because you loved them, and love makes us vulnerable. That's not a bug in your personality. It's a feature. The capacity to love deeply is what makes you human." Slowly, very slowly, Ethan began to heal. The sharp edges of betrayal softened into acceptance, and acceptance gradually transformed into wisdom. He started sleeping better, laughing more, and making plans for a future that didn't include people who saw him as a financial opportunity rather than a human being. 4 months after Gary and Madison's arrest, Ethan and I were having dinner at his house. Just the two of us, the way it used to be before his life became a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong people. "You know what's funny?" Ethan said, twirling pasta around his fork. "I keep expecting to miss them. The idea of family dinners having people around, all that domestic bliss I thought I wanted." "And do you miss them?" "No. This feels more like family than anything we had when they were here. No wondering about hidden agendas. No walking on eggshells. No worrying about what they really want from me." "That's because this is real," I said. "No performance, no manipulation, no ulterior motives, just us." "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you sooner." "You weren't ready to hear it, and that's okay. Sometimes we have to learn things the hard way, even when the tuition costs tens of thousands of dollars." Ethan smiled a real smile, not the forced ones he'd been wearing for months. "Even then, though, let's try not to make expensive life lessons a family tradition." We both laughed, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Ethan's house felt like home again, instead of a crime scene that happened to have furniture. 5 months later, Ethan and I found ourselves sitting in the Riverside County Courthouse for the final restitution hearing. Gary and Madison had both served their sentences and were being released. But the legal process required one last meeting to finalize the financial settlements. I watched them walk into the courtroom wearing orange jumpsuits and handcuffs, looking smaller and more ordinary than they had when they dominated Ethan's life. Prison had stripped away their polish and confidence, revealing them for what they really were: small-time criminals who'd gotten lucky with a particularly trusting target. Ethan sat beside me, his face calm but alert. The broken man who'd discovered his family's betrayal had been replaced by someone stronger and wiser, though the process of getting there had been painful to witness. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Angela Brooks," the bailiff announced. The hearing was brief and businesslike. Gary and Madison had already served their sentences. Most of the restitution had been paid, and everyone just wanted to close this chapter and move on with their lives. "Mr. Parker," Judge Brooks addressed Ethan directly, "you've recovered approximately 65% of the stolen funds through various legal mechanisms. The remaining amount has been written off as uncollectible. Do you have anything you'd like to say before I close this case?" Ethan stood up, and for a moment I worried he might say something he'd regret. But when he spoke, his voice was steady and thoughtful. "Your Honor, I don't need an apology from the defendants, and I don't need them to explain their actions. I understand what they did and why they did it.
What I want is for this experience to help other people avoid being victimized by similar schemes." He turned slightly to look at Gary and Madison. "I hope you both find a better way to live your lives going forward. Not for my sake, but for yours." The dignity in his response made me proud. Ethan had learned to separate his anger about their actions from his hope for their redemption. A mature distinction that showed how much he'd grown through this ordeal. After the hearing, Ethan and I walked out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sunshine. The reporters who'd followed the story initially had moved on to other scandals, and we were just two people walking down the courthouse steps, having survived their own personal hurricane. "How do you feel?" I asked as we reached the parking lot. "Relieved, like I can finally close that chapter and start writing a new one." Ethan paused beside his car. "You know what's strange? I keep expecting to feel more bitter about the whole thing." "What do you feel instead?" "Grateful, I guess. Grateful that I found out the truth before they could take everything. Grateful that I had you to help me through it. Grateful that I learned the difference between people who love you and people who love what you can do for them." "And what is the difference?" Ethan thought for a moment. "People who love you want you to be happy and successful. People who love what you can do for them want you to be useful and generous. The first group celebrates your victories. The second group calculates how they can benefit from them. That's a hard-earned piece of wisdom, the most expensive kind." Ethan smiled. "But maybe also the most valuable." We drove home together past the coffee shop where Gary and Madison used to meet, past the neighborhood where Ethan grew up without a father, past all the places where this story had unfolded. But instead of feeling like we were driving through a crime scene, it felt like we were leaving the past behind and heading towards something better. "What do you want to do for dinner?" I asked as we pulled into Ethan's driveway. "Actually, I was thinking about cooking. It's been a while since I made your favorite pasta. The one with the mushrooms and extra garlic." "Sounds perfect." As we walked into the house together, Ethan put his arm around my shoulders in a gesture that had become natural again after months of rebuilding trust and connection. "Hey, Mom." "Yeah, thanks for not giving up on me even when I was being stubborn and stupid about everything." That's what real family does, sweetheart. We stick around even when it's hard. We tell the truth even when it hurts. And we protect each other from people who want to hurt us, even when those people are supposed to be family too. Especially then. Ethan nodded, understanding finally settling into his bones like knowledge that would never leave him. "I think I get it now. Family isn't about blood or marriage or legal documents. It's about who shows up when things get hard and who's still there when the hard times are over." As we prepared dinner together, talking and laughing like we had when Ethan was young, I realized that we'd gained something precious from this terrible experience. We'd learned that our family, small as it was, could survive anything as long as we were honest with each other and willing to fight for what mattered. Gary and Madison had taught Ethan painful lessons about trust and betrayal. But they'd also taught him something valuable about resilience and recovery. He'd survived their worst intentions and come out stronger on the other side. We might be smaller than Ethan had once hoped for, but we were genuine. And sometimes, being genuine is worth more than being big. Sometimes, having one person who truly loves you is better than having 10 people who see you as an opportunity. Ethan had learned to tell the difference, and that knowledge would protect him for the rest of his life. Not bad for a family that had started with just a mother and her sons survived abandonment and betrayal, and emerged with their love for each other, intact and stronger than ever. The story wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new, better chapter. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.